My 15-year-old daughter uses a wheelchair. We were in court that day because Karen from the HOA had complained about our small home ramp. My daughter sat quietly in the front row, hands in her lap, being very good. The judge had already told Karen several times to sit down and stay calm. When the judge said, "The ramp is allowed," case closed, Karen got very angry. She reached into her big purse and pulled out an illegal stun gun. She walked straight to my daughter and pressed it against her arm. She pulled the trigger. A loud zap filled the courtroom. Electricity went through my daughter's body. She screamed in pain and fell out of her wheelchair onto the floor. Her body shook hard. A burn mark appeared on her skin. She looked up with tears and whispered, "Daddy, it hurts so much." Karen stepped back and said to the judge, "Now she won't need that stupid ramp." She looked proud of herself. She did not know that at that exact moment, the big courtroom doors opened. A man in full police chief uniform walked in fast. My husband, the police chief of the whole city who had just come back early from a work trip. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you were watching from, and please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. The courtroom was quieter than my daughter expected. Not peaceful, just heavy. Like the air itself was holding its breath. She sat in the front row of wooden benches, her wheelchair carefully positioned beside me. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers folded together the way she did when she was trying very hard to behave. She had chosen her nicest sweater that morning, the soft blue one, the one she said made her feel grown up. She was 15, but she looked smaller under the high ceiling and tall walls. We were there because of the ramp, the small, simple ramp leading to our front door, the one that let her leave the house safely, had somehow become a problem. Karen from the HOA had complained, again, and this time she had pushed it all the way to court. The judge had already spoken more than once. "Ma'am, you need to remain seated," he said, his voice firm but controlled. Karen ignored him. She stood stiffly in the aisle, arms tense at her sides, her jaw tight with frustration. Her face carried the look of someone who believed rules were weapons, tools meant to be used, not understood. "This isn't fair," she snapped. "They think they can just do whatever they want." My daughter flinched at the raised voice and lowered her eyes. I felt her shoulder tense beside. The judge sighed, patience thinning. "The ramp is allowed. It complies with the law. I've explained this already." Karen shook her head sharply. "That thing shouldn't be there. It ruins the neighborhood." A murmur moved through the courtroom. My daughter pressed her hands together more tightly. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Daddy." I leaned closer. "It's okay," I murmured. "Just stay still." The judge straightened in his chair. "Ma'am, this is your final warning. Sit down." For a moment, it looked like she might listen. Then something in her expression changed. Her shoulders stiffened. Her breathing quickened. She reached down toward her bag, movements sharp and sudden, as if she had made a decision she'd been holding back. Several people gasped. The bailiff took a step forward. "Ma'am," Karen ignored him. She moved toward the front row, toward my daughter, her face tight with anger and something else. Frustration, obsession, entitlement. My daughter's breath caught. "Daddy," she whispered, fear slipping into her voice. Time stretched thin. The judge stood abruptly. "Stop right there!" Chairs scraped, someone shouted. The room erupted into startled motion, and then the courtroom doors swung open with a loud echo that cut through everything. Every head turned. A tall man in a dark formal uniform stepped inside, his presence commanding immediate attention. His posture was straight, his expression controlled but intense. Authority followed him in like a shadow. My husband, the city's police chief, he had returned early from a work trip, something I hadn't even known yet, and now he stood framed in the doorway, eyes already scanning the room. "Enough," he said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The word carried weight, the kind that stops motion mid-step. Karen froze. The bailiff moved quickly, positioning himself between her and the front row. Another officer stepped forward. My husband crossed the room with purpose, not running, not rushing, but moving fast enough that everyone noticed. He knelt beside our daughter immediately. "Hey," he said softly, all authority gone from his voice. "I've got you." She reached for him without hesitation, gripping his sleeve as if grounding herself. "I was scared," she whispered. "I know," he said quietly. "You're safe now." The courtroom had gone completely silent. The judge remained standing, his expression tight but controlled. He looked from my husband to the bailiffs and then to Karen, who now stood rigid, her earlier confidence drained away. "Court officers," the judge said sharply. "Secure the room." 2 officers moved in smoothly, positioning themselves nearby. My husband stayed exactly where he was, one hand steady on our daughter's shoulder. He didn't glare, he didn't threaten, he simply stayed, present, protective, unmovable. The judge looked directly at Karen. "You are ordered to remain seated," he said. "You did not comply." She opened her mouth to speak, then hesitated, glancing at the officers. "This court will address your conduct shortly," the judge continued. "For now, you will step back." Karen took a step away, her posture stiff, her confidence unraveling. The courtroom felt different now, quieter, steadier, anchored. My daughter took a shaky breath and leaned into her father. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. He brushed a hand gently over her hair. "No, sweetheart, you didn't." The judge looked at her then, his expression softening. "You're right," he said gently. "You did nothing wrong." The room seemed to exhale. Outside the tall windows, sunlight spilled in, bright and calm, as if unaware of the tension that had just cracked open inside. But inside that courtroom, everything had changed. The complaint was no longer the center of attention. The ramp no longer mattered. What mattered was that a line had been crossed, and everyone in the room knew it. And as the courtroom settled into stunned silence, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer about rules, it was about accountability. And this was only the beginning. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Every movement slowed, every sound dulled, as if the air itself was waiting to see. What would happen next? The heavy doors at the back of the room had swung open, and for a moment no one spoke. A tall figure stood framed in the doorway, light from the hall outlining his silhouette. His posture was straight, his presence unmistakable, the kind that didn't demand attention yet somehow commanded it all the same. My husband. He stepped inside with steady purpose, his polished shoes echoing softly against the floor. His uniform was crisp, formal, unmistakable. The kind worn by someone used to responsibility, to command, to being the one people turned to when things went wrong. Conversations died mid-breath. Even the judge paused. My husband's eyes moved quickly across the room, the bench, the bailiff, the scattered onlookers, until they landed on our daughter. She sat frozen in her wheelchair, hands clenched together, her face pale. When she saw him, her eyes widened in relief, and her breath caught. "Dad," she whispered. He crossed the aisle in long, controlled steps, stopping directly beside her. Without hesitation, he lowered himself so he was level with her. "I'm here," he said quietly. His voice was calm, grounding. "You're okay." She nodded, swallowing hard. Her shoulders eased just a little as she leaned closer to him. Around them, the courtroom seemed to restart in slow motion. The judge straightened in his chair, clearing his throat. The bailiff shifted position, alert but no longer alarmed. A low murmur moved through the gallery, people exchanging glances as recognition set in. The judge spoke carefully. "Sir, you are?" My husband rose slowly, keeping one hand lightly on the back of my daughter's chair. "I'm her father," he said. "I was notified there was a disturbance." His tone was respectful, controlled, but firm enough to make it clear he wasn't there by accident. The judge nodded once. "Thank you for coming. Please remain where you are." My husband inclined his head in acknowledgement and stayed beside our daughter, his presence solid and steady. He didn't posture or raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room already felt different. Karen, who moments earlier had been standing rigid with agitation, now looked unsettled. Her arms were folded too tightly, her jaw clenched. She avoided looking directly at my husband, her eyes darting instead between the judge and the bailiff. The judge cleared his throat again. "Miss Reynolds, you were instructed to remain seated. You disregarded that instruction." Karen opened her mouth to speak, then closed it. Her confidence flickered. "I was just trying to explain," she started. "You will have a chance to speak," the judge interrupted calmly. "But you will do so when directed." Silence followed. My daughter shifted slightly in her chair. My husband leaned down again, speaking softly so only she could hear. "You're doing great," he said. "Just keep breathing with me." She nodded, matching his slow inhale and exhale. The judge glanced down at his notes, then looked back up. Let us return to the matter before the court. He reviewed the case briefly, the complaint, the inspection, the written determinations already made. His tone was measured, deliberate. The ramp in question complies with accessibility requirements, he said. There is no violation. A quiet ripple passed through the courtroom. Karen stiffened. The judge continued. I've stated this more than once. The ruling has not changed. Karen shifted her weight, clearly struggling to contain herself. But it's not fair, she began. The judge raised a hand. That is enough. His voice was not loud, but it carried authority. This court will not allow disruptions. Karen's mouth snapped shut. Her shoulders tensed. The bailiff took a subtle step closer to her, a quiet reminder of boundaries. My husband, Ramai. Ned where he was, steady as stone. He said nothing, but his presence alone seemed to anchor the room. The judge's gaze softened slightly as he looked toward my daughter. You've been very patient, he said to her. You've done nothing wrong today. She looked up at him, surprised, then nodded slowly. Thank you, she whispered. The judge gave a small, approving nod in return. Around them, the atmosphere had shifted. What moments earlier had been chaos was now controlled, structured, and calm. The emotional storm had passed its peak. Karen looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in presence. The authority she had carried in with her had slipped away, replaced by uncertainty. The judge turned back to his papers. We will continue, he said, but first, everyone will take a moment to reset. This courtroom will remain respectful. He glanced pointedly in Karen's direction. My husband gently squeezed our daughter's shoulder. You're safe, he murmured. She nodded again, her breathing steady now. The room settled into a careful quiet, like water after a stone has sunk beneath the surface. Outside the tall windows, sunlight filtered in, calm and indifferent, as if the world beyond the courtroom had no idea how close things had come to breaking apart inside. But something had changed. A line had been drawn, the balance of power had shifted, and the man who had just walked in, calm, composed, unwavering, had made it clear without raising his voice or lifting a hand that this story was no longer going to unfold the way it once might have. This was only the beginning. The courtroom settled into a fragile stillness, the kind that follows disruption but carries the promise of clarity. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the paperwork in front of him, then back up at the room, his gaze slow and deliberate. Before we proceed, he said, I want to understand Exa. How we arrived at this point. His eyes moved first to Karen. Ms. Reynolds, you filed this complaint. You will now explain clearly and calmly what your concern was. Karen straightened, clearly bracing herself. She smoothed the front of her jacket as if trying to regain the authority she had lost moments earlier. The ramp violates neighborhood appearance standards, she said sharply. It doesn't match the rest of the houses. I've told them many times. It should be removed. The judge tilted his head slightly. And were you aware that accessibility modifications are protected by law? Karen hesitated. I know there are exceptions, but there are no exceptions in this case, the judge interrupted, his tone firm but controlled. The documentation is clear. A soft murmur moved through the courtroom. Karen pressed her lips together. It still affects property values. The judge exhaled slowly, as if weighing his next words. Property values do not override a person's right to access their own home. Silence followed. My daughter shifted slightly in her wheelchair. My husband leaned in just enough for her to hear him. You're okay, he whispered. Just listen. She nodded, gripping the armrest but sitting a little straighter now. The judge turned to the clerk. Please read the compliance summary. The clerk stood and began reading from the file. Her voice was steady and factual. The ramp was inspected. It meets all municipal and federal accessibility requirements. No violations were found. No corrective action was recommended. Each sentence landed like a quiet verdict. Karen's jaw tightened. She crossed her arms, then uncrossed them again. The judge looked up. Ms. Reynolds, were you informed of this finding? Yes, she said reluctantly. And yet you continued to file complaints. I was trying to protect the neighborhood, she snapped. A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. The judge's tone sharpened slightly. Protecting a neighborhood does not include targeting a family or creating repeated conflict when no violation exists. He paused, then added, especially not when that family includes a minor. Karen's eyes flicked briefly toward my daughter, then away. The judge turned his attention outward. Are there any witnesses who wish to speak? For a moment, no one moved. Then a woman in the second row stood. I live 2 houses down, she said quietly. She's been complaining about that ramp for months, even after being told it was allowed. Another person stood. She's confronted them more than once. A third voice followed. She talks about it all the time, says it ruins the street. The courtroom filled with low murmurs as more people nodded in agreement. Karen spun toward them. That's not true. The judge raised a hand. Enough. Silence returned. He leaned forward slightly. The pattern being described here is concerning. Karen swallowed hard. This court is not only concerned with whether a rule was broken, the judge continued, but with whether behavior has crossed into harassment. The word hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Karen's shoulders stiffened. I never harassed anyone. The judge looked at her steadily. That determination will not be made today, but it will be reviewed. My daughter shifted again. Her breathing was steadier now, but her eyes stayed fixed on the judge, listening closely. He turned toward her gently. You've been very patient, he said, and I want to say something clearly so there is no confusion. She looked up. You did nothing wrong by being here today. You did nothing wrong by needing accommodations, and you did nothing wrong by existing as you are. Her eyes widened slightly. My husband felt her relax against him, just a little. The judge continued, his voice ying through the room. No one is allowed to make you feel otherwise. The silence that followed felt different, warmer, steadier. Karen shifted again, clearly uncomfortable. The judge glanced down at his notes once more. Given what has been presented, he said, this court will formally dismiss the complaint regarding the ramp. A soft exhale passed through the room. My daughter closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. But the judge wasn't finished. Additionally, he said, this court is referring the conduct displayed today for further administrative review. Karen's head snapped up. What does that mean? It means, the judge replied evenly, that appropriate authorities will determine whether further action is necessary. Her face drained of color. This court expects all parties to behave with civility and restraint, he continued, especially when a child is involved. He paused, letting the words settle. The room was completely silent now. Finally, he set his pen down. That is all for the moment. The gavel struck lightly, not loud, not dramatic. Final. People began to stir, whispering quietly to one another. Some looked stunned. Others looked relieved. My husband exhaled slowly, the tension finally easing from his shoulders. He leaned toward our daughter. You did great. She nodded, her eyes shining but calm. Around them, the courtroom had changed. Where once there had been tension and accusation, there was now awareness and accountability. Karen remained standing for a moment longer, frozen in place, as if unsure what to do next. The truth had come out, not with shouting, not with force, but with words, witnesses, and the weight of reality. And once spoken aloud, it could not be taken back. The courtroom no longer felt like it belonged to one voice. Where moments earlier tension had crackled through the air, now there was something heavier. A quiet awareness settling over everyone present. The judge remained seated, hands folded, eyes thoughtful. The clerk typed steadily. The bailiff stood alert but calm, and Karen, who had once filled the room with certainty, now stood very still. Her confidence had not vanished all at once. It drained slowly, leaking away in small moments. The way her shoulders dropped, the way her eyes darted instead of holding contact, the way her lips pressed together as if holding back words she no longer trusted herself to say. The judge cleared his throat. This court takes patterns of conduct seriously, he said evenly, especially when those patterns involve repeated complaints against the same household. He glanced down at his notes, then back up. The testimony today indicates that this matter has gone beyond a simple disagreement. Karen shifted her weight. I was just enforcing the rules. The judge met her gaze. Rules do not exist in a vacuum. They exist to serve people, not to be used as tools of pressure. The words were calm but firm enough to land. A murmur passed through the courtroom, quickly stilled by the bailiff's raised hand. My daughter sat quietly beside her father, her back straighter now than it had been earlier. She watched the judge closely, her expression serious but no longer fearful. My husband stayed near her, his posture relaxed but protective, his attention never straying far. The judge continued, "You were informed that the ramp met accessibility requirements. You were informed more than once." Karen's jaw tightened. "I didn't agree with the decision." "You are not required to agree," the judge replied. "You are required to respect it." Silence followed. The judge turned to the clerk. "Please note that repeated complaints were filed after the determination was made." The clerk nodded, fingers moving over the keyboard. The judge then addressed the again. "When lawful decisions are ignored and pressure continues, that becomes a concern, especially when it involves a minor." Karen inhaled sharply. "I never meant to cause harm," she said quickly. The judge's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Intent does not erase impact." Those words seemed to echo. Across the room, a few people shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded faintly, as if recognizing something they had felt but never named. My daughter's hand tightened around the armrest. My husband leaned closer and whispered, "You're doing great." She nodded, eyes still fixed forward. The judge folded his hands again. "This court is therefore taking the following steps." Every sound in the room faded. "First, the complaint regarding the ramp is formally dismissed. It is lawful, necessary, and protected." A soft breath moved through the gallery. "Second," he continued, "this matter will be referred for administrative review to determine whether further action is required regarding the conduct involved." Karen's eyes widened slightly. "This review is not a punishment," the judge clarified. "It is a safeguard. Its purpose is to ensure that authority, formal or informal, is not misused." Karen looked down, her earlier defiance replaced by unease. The judge then shifted his gaze toward my daughter. His voice softened. "You have been patient and respectful throughout this process," he said. "You should never feel that you have to justify your needs." She blinked, then nodded. The judge gave a small, reassuring smile. "You did nothing wrong." Something loosened in her posture, a tension she hadn't even realized she was holding. The judge looked next at my husband. "Thank you for maintaining composure under difficult circumstances." My husband inclined his head slightly. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge straightened in his chair. "This court expects all parties to treat one another with dignity. That expectation applies both inside and outside this room." His gaze passed briefly over Karen again before returning to the bench. "With that said, we will adjourn." The gavel came down once, not sharply, not angrily, decisively, a sound that marked an ending. For a moment no one moved. Then quiet motion resumed, chairs shifting, papers gathering, murmured conversations restarting. Karen remained where she was for several seconds longer than everyone else. She looked around, as if trying to regain footing in a space that no longer responded to her presence. Finally, she picked up her bag and stood. Her movements were slower now, more cautious. She avoided looking toward us as she stepped into the aisle and made her way toward the exit. There was no confrontation, no final words, only distance. My husband gently placed a hand on our daughter's shoulder. "You did well," he said softly. She looked up at him, searching his face. "It's really over? For today," he said. "Yes." She nodded, breathing out slowly. Around us, people began to disperse. A few offered quiet nods or brief smiles of reassurance. No one spoke loudly. The mood had shifted from tension to reflection. As we stood to leave, my daughter paused and looked once more toward the bench, then toward the door Karen had exited through. Something thoughtful crossed her face. Then she turned forward again. Whatever power had once filled that room had changed hands. Not through force, not through shouting, but through clarity and boundaries. The system had spoken, and for the first time that day, it had spoken in her favor. The courtroom didn't empty all at once. People moved slowly now, as if no one wanted to be the first to break the strange stillness that had settled after the judge's ruling. Chairs scraped softly, papers were gathered, low murmurs aced tension, but even those sounded restrained, thoughtful. Something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Karen remained standing near her seat, motionless. The rigid confidence she'd carried into the courtroom had dissolved into something brittle and uncertain. Her shoulders were slightly hunched now, her hands clasped together as if she didn't know what to do with them. Around her, no one made eye contact. That absence spoke louder than any accusation. My husband stayed beside our daughter, his presence calm and grounding. She rested her hands in her lap, watching the room with careful eyes. The fear that had once tightened her posture had softened into quiet alertness. She was still processing everything, but she was no longer shrinking. The judge gathered his papers and stood. Before leaving the bench, he looked out once more across the room. "I want to be clear," he said, his voice steady but firm. "What occurred here today is a reminder that authority must be exercised responsibly. Power does not come from position alone. It comes from restraint." He paused briefly, letting that settle. "This court will not tolerate behavior that intimidates or targets others, especially when that behavior is repeated." His gaze passed over Karen again, not with anger, but with unmistakable finality. The gavel struck once. The sound echoed, sharp and final. That was it. The moment that had carried so much tension was over. People began to stand. Conversations started again, though quieter than before. Some faces looked thoughtful. Others looked unsettled. A woman in the second row leaned toward another and whispered, "I didn't know it was like that." Her companion nodded. "None of us did." Karen shifted, glancing around as if expecting someone to say something to her, to defend her, maybe. No one did. Instead, two court staff approached her calmly. One said, not unkindly. "We need to go over a few procedural steps before you leave." Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She nodded once, stiffly. As they spoke to her in low voices, she shrank inward, her earlier sharpness dulled by reality. Whatever authority she had once felt no longer protected her. Across the room, my husband knelt slightly so he could look our daughter in the eye. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though her voice was small. "I think so." He smiled gently. "That's enough for right now." She studied his face, searching for reassurance, then leaned closer. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder, grounding her in the moment. A few people approached us hesitantly. One woman offered a small, sincere smile. "Your daughter was very brave." Another nodded. "You handled that with a lot of grace." We thanked them quietly. There was no triumph in it, only relief. Across the room, Karen finally gathered her things. Her movements were slow and deliberate, no longer sharp or commanding. She avoided looking in our direction as she stepped into the aisle. For a brief moment, she paused, as if considering whether to say something. She didn't. She walked past without a word, her footsteps echoing softly as she left the courtroom. The silence she left behind felt heavy, but also clean, a kind of clearing. My daughter watched her go, then looked up at her father. "She can't tell me what to do anymore, right?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "No, she can't." Her shoulders loosened just a little more. The courtroom continued to empty until only a few people remained. The judge had already exited. Clerks organized files. The bailiff nodded politely as we prepared to leave. As we stood, my daughter hesitated, then looked back once more at the now empty bench. "I was scared," she admitted softly. "I know," my husband said. "But you didn't let that stop you from showing up." She thought about that. "I didn't?" she asked. "No," he said gently. "You stayed. You spoke when you needed to. That takes strength." She considered his words, then nodded, as if storing them away somewhere safe. Outside the courtroom, the hallway felt brighter. The tension that had pressed down on everything inside seemed to fade with each step. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, warming the stone floor. Voices echoed faintly from other corridors, ordinary sounds of an ordinary day resuming. My daughter rolled forward slowly, then stopped. "Dad?" she asked. "Yes? Are we in trouble?" He crouched beside her so their eyes were level. "No, you're not in trouble. You did nothing wrong. You never did." She let out a long breath, one she'd clearly been holding for a while. "Okay," she said softly. We walked together toward the exit. Behind us, the courtroom door closed quietly, not with a bang, but with a final, gentle click. And with it, something else closed too. a chapter defined by fear, pressure, and silence. What remained was not celebration, not revenge, but something steadier and stronger, clarity, accountability, and the beginning of peace. The courthouse doors closed behind us with a quiet final sound, not a slam, not a dramatic echo, just a soft click, the kind that marks an ending you don't fully understand until you're already walking away from it. Outside, the afternoon air felt different. Lighter, warmer, almost unreal after the heavy stillness inside. Sunlight spilled across the steps, catching dust in the air, turning it gold for a moment before it drifted away. My daughter sat quietly in her wheelchair, her hands resting in her lap. She looked tired, but not frightened anymore. The tightness in her shoulders had eased, replaced by something gentler, relief, maybe, or the beginning of it. My husband stayed close, one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, the other ready to steady her if she needed it. He hadn't said much since we left the courtroom. He didn't need to. His presence said enough. For a moment, none of us spoke. We just stood there, breathing in the ordinary sounds of the city, footsteps, distant traffic, a door opening somewhere behind us, life moving forward again. "I thought I was in trouble," my daughter said quietly. The words landed heavier than anything that had been said inside the courtroom. My husband immediately crouched beside her so they were eye level. His voice was calm, steady, sure. "You were never in trouble," he said. "Not for 1 second." She searched his face as if testing the truth of it. "But everyone was mad," she said. He shook his head gently. "They weren't mad at you. They were fixing something that shouldn't have happened." She considered that for a moment, then nodded slowly. Across the steps, a few people lingered. Strangers from the courtroom who now felt oddly familiar. One woman offered a small, reassuring smile. Another gave a quiet nod, the kind that carried understanding without needing words. No one stared, no one whispered. There was no spectacle left, just people moving on. Karen exited last. She didn't look angry anymore. She didn't look powerful. She looked small, folded in on herself, eyes fixed ahead as if afraid to meet anyone else's gaze. She walked past us without speaking, without looking up. There was no satisfaction in watching her go, only closure. My daughter watched her leave, then turned back to her father. "She can't make us take the ramp away, right?" she asked softly. "No," he said. "She can't." The certainty in his voice mattered more than the words themselves. We made our way down the steps slowly. He walked beside her, matching her pace, never rushing. The afternoon sun warmed the concrete, and for the first time all day, the air felt calm instead of heavy. The drive home was quiet but comfortable. The tension that had followed us for weeks seemed to loosen its grip with every block we passed. The familiar streets looked the same trees, the same houses, but something about them felt different now, safer. When we pulled into our driveway, my daughter looked at the ramp for a long moment. It sat there exactly as it always had, simple, solid, unremarkable to anyone who didn't need it. To her, it was freedom, independence, a way in and out of her own world. "It's still here," she said softly. "Yes," I told her, "and it's not going anywhere." She smiled, just a little. Inside the house, everything felt quieter than usual, like the walls themselves were resting. She curled up on the couch with her blanket, exhaustion finally catching up to her. The day had taken more out of her than she realized. My husband brought her a glass of water and sat beside her. "You were really brave today," he said. She frowned slightly. "I didn't do anything." He smiled. "You showed up. That counts." She thought about that, then nodded slowly. Outside, the afternoon faded into evening. The light softened. Shadows stretched across the yard. Somewhere nearby, a bird called out. Then another answered. Later, as she rested, I stood by the window and watched the street. A neighbor walked by and waved. Another paused and gave a small, supportive smile. No one said anything. They didn't need to. The silence felt different now, not heavy, peaceful. That night, as I tucked my daughter into bed, she reached for my hand. "Daddy?" she whispered. "Yes? Thank you for not letting T and be mean to me." The words caught in my chest. I squeezed her hand gently. "You never deserve that, ever." She nodded, her eyes already drifting closed. When I stepped back into the hallway, the house was quiet. My husband stood there for a moment, listening to her slow, steady breathing through the door. "It's over," he said quietly. I nodded. "It is." Outside, the ramp rested under the porch light. Unchanged, unremarkable, solid. A simple structure that had somehow carried the weight of fear, conflict, and finally resolution. It hadn't moved. And neither had we, because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with noise or applause. Sometimes it comes quietly, after the doors close, when everyone finally understands what should have been obvious all along. That dignity isn't something you earn, that access is not a favor, and that standing up, calmly, firmly, together, can change the outcome more than anger ever could. The house settled into silence, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like peace.